Hi everyone. In this lecture video, we will be talking about intangible assets. We will going to have a detailed discussion regarding PAS 38 or IAS 38. Let us talk about the definition of intangible assets. When we say intangible assets, we will going to strictly follow what is the requirements of the accounting standards. An intangible assets, those are assets that can be identified, but in terms of non-monetary assets, meaning to say is that there will be no monetary value on this one, or this is unlike with the other assets wherein you are not going to translate it as cash. Then another definition of intangible assets is that since it's called intangible, this is the opposite of the tangible, it doesn't have any physical substance. There are three essential characteristics of intangible assets. We have the identifiability, control, and future economic benefits. When we say that an intangible assets, or for us to say that an intangible asset is identifiable, the first thing that you have to remember is that if it has the capacity to be separated, or if it arises from a contractual or other legal right. When we say that the intangible asset is separable, then it has the capacity to be transferred, exchanged, sold, or licensed out individually. When we say individually, you are going to sell, to license out an intangible assets collectively or on an individual package. But at the end of the day, what you're going to take a look at is that the capacity for you to transfer it, to sell it, or to license it. Or in some other scenarios, you can rent out the intangible assets, or you can exchange the intangible assets to another intangible assets or to other assets. When we say control, the entity has the ability to have the economic benefit. The entity who will receive the economic benefit here, it should be the one to recognize the intangible assets. Let's talk about the sources of control for an intangible asset. First is that we have here the legal rights. Here in the Philippines, we have the Intellectual Property Code. Then we have here the Intellectual Property Office, wherein you will register your intangible assets so that you will become the legal owner of that intellectual property. Then another thing is that we have here the substance over form. Let's say you have the control for the asset. You can sell the asset, you can transfer the asset, then understandably in an accounting point of view, then you have the control on that kind of asset. Let us talk about the future economic benefits. First, this is the common one, is that you will incur or you will earn revenue from the sale of products and or services. The second one is to reduce the production cost. Then if you can reduce your cost, then you can earn savings. The last one is for you to use the assets. Let's say, for example, you have recognized a specific asset, then you would wanted it to be rent out to other parties or to the third parties, then you will record an economic benefit as rent income for this one. But in terms of intangible assets, you can license out the intangible assets. You will receive a proceeds. Before we go to the next slide, let's talk about the concept of the goodwill. First thing that you have to remember, just like with other intangible assets, goodwill do not have physical substance. It is not considered under the Intangible Assets Accounting Standard or PAS 38 or IAS 38. Then the goodwill is to be recorded using the requirements of PFRS 3 for business combination, PFRS 10 for consolidated financial statements, and PAS 36 for the impairment of asset. For the PAS 36, we will have a separate lecture video on that one, which I will be posting the link in your screen. An intangible asset is recognized when it meets the definition of the asset recognition criteria. Let's have a refresh on the asset recognition criteria. If you can see that there is a probability of a future economic benefits and the cost can be measured reliably, then you can measure an asset. Let us talk about the initial measurement of intangible assets prescribed by the PAS 38 or IAS 38. The first thing that you have to remember is that just like with other assets, it is measured at cost. Then, an intangible assets can be acquired into multiple number of ways. First, this is the common one, is that you can purchase an intangible asset. Then the second one, just like with the Goodwill, you can acquire an intangible asset as part of your business combination. Let's say company A and company B would wanted to combine their assets or would wanted to combine their business. Then if there are intangible assets from one or both of the parties, then it will be recorded in the new set of books under the business combination. The third one is that you're going to receive an intangible asset from a government grant. Then you can acquire a specific asset by exchange of assets. Then just like with tangible property, you can generate your own intangible assets internally. After initially measuring the intangible assets, let us talk about the subsequent measurement. There are two models that you can avail for the intangible asset. The first one is we have the cost model, wherein you will go in to measure the intangible asset by deducting the accumulated amortization and deducting the accumulated impairment loss to the initial cost or to our acquisition cost. Then with respect to the revaluation model, you should be able to get the fair market value at the date of revaluation. Then you have to deduct the accumulated depreciation and accumulated amortization from the fair market value. Reminder in using the revaluation model, you can only use this model if there is an active market. Now, if the intangible asset do not have any active market, then your only option is to use only the cost model. Let us talk about the presentation and disclosure requirements prescribed by the PAS 38 or IAS 38. The first thing that you have to remember is that intangible assets are presented separately from the goodwill. Because if you're going to take a look at per line item, there will be an intangible assets. All of your intangible assets will be totaled there. For example, you have the copyrights, you have the patents, you have the customer's list. All of their amounts will be presented in a one-line item, provided that if you have a goodwill that arises from, let's say, for example, a business combination, you will going to present the goodwill separately from the intangible assets, from the other intangible assets. If you are about to derecognize a specific intangible asset, there are two ways prescribed by the accounting standard. The first one is that if you're going to dispose a specific intangible asset, let's say disposal means here is that you're going to sell the intangible assets, or there will be no future economic benefits that will arise from the intangible asset. Then that's the trigger for you to recognize a specific intangible asset based on the accounting standards. Kindly take note that for any disposal, the gain or loss which will be recorded in the profit or loss should be the difference between the proceeds and the carrying amount of your derecognized intangible assets. Actually, for any other assets, for example, you have the tangible assets, you have the inventories, then You will use this formula to recognize any gain or loss from the disposal of that asset. Let us talk about one of the issues if you're going to acquire an intangible assets and a tangible assets. The first thing that you have to ask to yourself is that which is more significant or dominated in your transaction. If you saw that the intangible asset is an integral part of the property, plant, and equipment, then you will record the transaction, both the PPE and both the intangible asset as part of the property, plant, and equipment under PAS 16. But if the intangible asset is not an integral part for the property, plant, and equipment, then you will record separately the tangible asset under PAS 16, then you will record the intangible asset under PAS 38. Now, you have to remember that in determining whether such an asset is to be accounted for as PPE or intangible asset, the entity uses judgment to assess which element is more significant. At the end of the day, this is the judgment of the entity who will record the assets. Let us talk about the different modes of acquisition of an intangible asset. The first method that we will going to discuss is by having separate acquisition or by purchase. The first thing that you have to remember are the inclusions and exclusions from this method of acquisition. For the inclusions, we have here the purchase price plus import duties plus non-refundable taxes. Then you will going to deduct the trade discounts and rebates. Then you should also include any directly attributable cost from the purchase of that intangible asset. For the exclusion, let's say we're going to introduce a new product or we're going to conduct business in a new location, and any administrative and general cost, all of those costs will be excluded as part of the acquisition cost or as part of the intangible asset. Here are the example of directly attributable costs. If you can account for the cost of employee benefits and professional fees that are directly related to bring the assets to its working condition, then you're going to include those two costs. Then, if the cost of testing is necessary for you to check the asset, if it's functioning well or if it's functioning properly, then you will include the cost of testing to the intangible asset. Then let's talk about what if the payment is deferred. When we say deferred, we are talking about that the payment will be made in the future. If the payment is deferred, the cost is equal to the cash price equivalent. Then, the difference between the amount and the total payments is recognized as interest expense over the credit period unless the interest expense will be qualified to be capitalized under PAS 23. But if you think that the interest payments or interest expense is not capitalizable, then you will going to record it as an outright expense. Let's talk about the another mode of acquisition, which is from business combination. When we say business combination is that we have here company A and company B, then they wanted to combine their business to form company AB, then here are some guidelines with respect to their intangible assets. If you're going to acquire a specific intangible asset, the first thing that you have to remember or to look for is the fair market value at acquisition date. Then the acquirer will recognize the intangible asset will be recorded in the combined business of these two separate entities. Then again, if there will be goodwill from the combined businesses, then the goodwill is to be presented separately. in compliance with the requirements of the PAS 38 or IAS 38. Then, just a reminder, even though the goodwill will arise before or after the business combination, again, the goodwill will be presented separately in the face of the financial statements or in the balance sheet. Let us talk about intangible assets acquired by way of government grants. There are two ways that you can measure the intangible asset. The first one is by using its fair market value, or the second one is you're going to use whatever is the nominal value or the stated value plus any direct cost attributed from the government grants. Let's talk about the last modes of acquisition, which is by exchanges of assets. When we say we are going to exchange an intangible asset, it should only involve non-monetary asset. Then we have here the concept of commercial substance. We will going to use the definition of PricewaterhouseCoopers. They said that the commercial substance occurs when a transaction causes an identifiable and measurable change in the economic circumstances of an entity. Which brings us to say that the exchange, it can be in two ways. It can have a commercial substance or it is lacking of commercial substance. We have different hierarchy for these two scenarios. So in the first one, if there is a commercial substance, the fair market value of asset given up plus cash payment, if this is not provided, then you will use the fair market value of asset received. Then if number 1 and number 2 cannot be observed, then you will record the carrying amount of the assets plus any cash payments and any cash received for the asset given up. Then, if the transaction is lacking of commercial substance, then you will only use the third priority, which is using the carrying amount of the asset given up plus cash payment less cash received. Now, let's talk about the phases of internally generated intangible assets. Let us say that we are obtaining new knowledge, or we are searching, or we are evaluating applications of research findings. Then you are searching for the alternative materials, alternative processes, alternative systems. Then if you are still formulating the design and the possible alternative for your final output, then you are considered in the research phase. Then kindly take note that all of the costs that you have incurred during the research phase will be expensed outrightly, since there will be no future economic benefit from here. Let us talk about the development phase. Here in our timeline, the one highlighted in green shade will be the research phase. So again, research phase is that you're going to record it as an outright expense. But if during the development phase, you saw that the intangible asset has a technical feasibility, you have the intention to complete the intangible asset, there is a probable future economic benefit, then you can measure reliably the cost and you have the ability to sell or use the asset, then you will record whatever is the cost that you will incur from the development cost as part of the intangible asset. Take note that these 5 should be present for you to capitalize the development cost as part of the intangible asset. The entry to record the research and development is that we will go into debit research and development expense, then we'll go into credit cash or accounts payable. But again, if the development cost will be capitalized to the intangible asset, our debit here should be the intangible asset. Let us have the accounting treatment for the research and development expenses. Research costs and development costs that do not qualify for capitalization are expensed and disclosed as research and development expense. However, only those expenditures incurred in R&D activities, for example, you would wanted to invent a future product, are considered R&D expenses. Expenses incurred on non-R&D activities such as commercial production, routinary changes in existing products, those will not be going to be part of the R&D expenses, but rather we have the regular expenses. Okay? So again, regular expenses should be separated or presented separately from the research and development expenses. Let's have an example of regular expenses. We have here, the first one is those expenses used for commercial production. Let's say we have here the troubleshooting costs during the commercial production, the modification of design for a specific customer, then the quality control during the commercial production. All of those will be recorded as part of the regular expenses and not research and development expenses. With respect to the marketing and research and advertising expense, again, since there is no technical viability on this one, then it is to be considered as part of the regular expenses and not research and development expenses. Here are the examples of R&D expenses. If you're looking for the prototypes or the entity is searching for the alternatives, then it should be recorded as part of R&D expenses. For the prototypes, the example for this one is that the costs related to obtain new knowledge, then modeling prototypes, testing the prototypes, revising the design or the system of the prototypes, and the salaries related or salaries incurred or professional fees incurred that are directly related to the R&D, all of those will be recorded as part of research and development expense. Let us have the illustration or the cost. Let us have the illustration wherein the intangible asset is acquired through purchase. The purchase price here is that the purchase price here, it should be understood that this is the total cost plus the necessary cost. Then you have to deduct the non-refundable taxes and rebates. What are the necessary costs? We have here two kinds of necessary costs, the cost of labor and the professional fees. Let us talk about key accounting terms for intangible assets. We have three accounting terms that we will going to use repeatedly in this lecture recording. We have the useful life, amortization, and residual value. When we say useful life, there are two kinds of useful life. We have the finite useful life and the indefinite useful life. If an intangible asset will have a finite useful life, it will be amortized. When we say finite useful life, the number of years that you can use the intangible asset can be determined properly. But when we say that the intangible asset will have indefinite useful life, is not synonymous to an infinite useful life. Because if, for example, a specific intangible asset will be legally restricted, then you cannot use the intangible asset, then you're going to derecognize the intangible asset. But unlike with finite intangible assets, you're going to test for impairment any intangible assets that will have indefinite useful life. Here are the factors in determining the useful life. The first one is that you have to reflect the expected usage of assets. you have to consider the product life cycle. You have to factor in any technological restriction or technological advancement regarding the intangible asset. You have to take a look at the industry standards, and you have to watch out for any legal restrictions. Let us discuss amortization. According to the standard, amortization is the systematic allocation of depreciable amount of an intangible assets over its useful life. The accounting standard doesn't favor any amortization method. You can use straight line, diminishing balance, or units of production, provided that the amortization method implemented by a company should reflect the pattern of consumption of the future economic benefits. This timeline will give you an idea on where to start amortizing and where to stop the recording of the amortization. You're going to start amortizing a specific intangible asset if asset is already available for use, up to the moment that the entity will going to recognize whether they're going to sell or they are going to dispose the asset. Then that's about time that you will end or you will cease the recording of your amortization. Let us talk about the concept of residual value. Residual value is to be assumed as zero unless there is a commitment from the third party to purchase the intangible asset, or there is an existence of an active market. What are the requirements of the accounting standard for the residual value? The first thing that you have to remember is that there should be an annual review of amortization method. Then the second one is there should be an assessment of the estimates of useful life and the residual value at each year end. If there will be changes in the accounting estimates, then that changes should be applied prospectively or after the date that you have implemented such change in accounting estimates. Let us talk about accounting treatment for various types of intangible assets. The first one is we have trademarks. An example of trademark is that if you're going to see a branding or if you're going to see a trade name that will have this mark in their logos, then you should be able to distinguish unregistered trademark to the registered trademark. For the internally generated trademark or trade name, what you're only going to record is only the directly attributable costs that are related to the creation, to the production, or for the usage of the intangible asset. But take note that unlike with other kinds of intangible asset, trademarks are not to be amortized but tested for impairment. Therefore, you can say that the trademark is an example of an intangible asset that will have an indefinite useful life. What are the amounts that you will going to record for the trademark? At initial recognition, all directly attributable costs will be part of the intangible asset, but the subsequent expenditures, if it should be capitalized, it should be added to the trademark. But if the subsequent expenditures will not give any benefit from the trademark, then it will be recorded as an outright expenses. The reason why a registered trademark is to be considered as an intangible asset with indefinite useful life is because the trademark can last for 10 years, but the owner, the legal owner of the trademark can renew it indefinitely. Then here are the relevant journal entries for the trademarks. We will go into debit the trademark and credit cash or accounts payable. Then again, there will be no entry of amortization But if at year end, you will notice that the recoverable amount, when we say recoverable amount, we are looking at the future economic benefits or the inflow of benefits that the entity will going to record. If the recoverable amount is less than the carrying amount, then you can safely say that the intangible asset or the trademark is impaired. Then you will record debit impairment loss, then credit accumulated impairment. Let us talk about website or internet domains. You will only recognize website or internet domains if and only if both of these criteria will be met. Okay? The first one is that you're going to record it if you have satisfied the asset recognition principle. That is, there is a probability of future economic benefit and the cost can be measured reliably. Then the second one is that if these 5 requirements, you can see all of these requirements, again, technical feasibility, ability to sell, intention to complete, probable future economic benefits, and the cost can be measured reliably, then this is the time that you will capitalize the cost and you will record. If one of these requirement will not be met, then you will not going to record any cost as part of your intangible asset. We have 5 stages for the website. We have the planning, application, design stage, content development stage, and operating stage. If the website is still in the planning stage, then all of the costs incurred there or incurred in this phase will be expense immediately. But if you are in the application or you are in the design stage, then if the intangible asset will meet all the criteria presented here, then that's the time that you will record the internet domain or website as an intangible asset. But after the design phase, for the content development and for the operating stage, you will record any cost as an outright expense. The key takeaway here is that you have to look for the cost in the application and design stage for you to recognize it as part of intangible asset. Let us talk about customers list. Before recognizing the customers list, you have to be careful in assessing this one. If the customer list is internally generated, then all of those costs will be an outright expense. But if the customer's list, you purchase it from other party, then you will record as part of your asset the purchase price plus any directly attributable cost. The journal entry applicable for the customer's list is you're going to debit customer's list, then credit cash, then customer's list will be amortized based on its useful life. You're going to record debit amortization expense, then credit accumulated amortization. Let us talk about the accounting treatment for franchises. There are 2 types of franchises. The first one is according to parties. Franchise can arise from 2 private entities or individuals, and it can arise from private entities or individuals and with the government. The second one is according to periods. We have here finite franchises and indefinite franchises. For franchises with finite useful life, this should be amortized over the useful life. Here are the journal entries relevant to franchises with finite useful life. Debit franchise, credit cash, or accounts payable. If at the year end, we're going to debit amortization expense, then credit accumulated amortization. Then for any periodic franchise fees, we're going to debit franchise expense and credit cash. For franchises with indefinite useful life, we will going to use the present value. Then for the journal entries, will go into record debit franchises. It is a case-to-case basis if you're going to record a discount on notes payable or a credit on premium on notes. If you have paid notes payable, then credit cash. Every end of the period, you're going to amortize the discount or the premiums. In this case, this is your journal entry if you will recognize discount on notes. Then the same entry is to be applied for the periodic franchise fees, regardless if you are having a finite useful life or an indefinite useful life. For copyright and patents, these two will be under the Intellectual Property Code of the Philippines or Republic Act 8293. For the copyright, it should be noted that the useful life is from the lifetime of the creator plus 10 years upon the death of the creator. Let us say a specific author published his or her books on the year 2000. Then he or she died on the year 2010. Then you're going to add plus 50 years. So the end of the useful life of the copyright will be from or will be until year 2060. Then the cost of the copyright should be amortized over the useful life. Let us talk about the useful life of the patents. If you can determine the useful life of the patents, then you should be able to amortize it every end of each year or every end of each period. But if you cannot determine properly the useful life of a specific copyright, then all of those copyright will be recorded as an outright expense. Let us talk about patent. Patent will have two types. We have the product patents and we have the process patents. The example of product patents are the design of the phones, design of the computers. The example of process patents is, let's say, you have a new way to pasteurize a milk. Then you can apply for a patent on that kind of process. Then we have two kinds of acquisition: the purchase patents and the internally generated patents. Take note that for the purchase patents, you will only record the purchase price plus the directly attributable cost. But if the patent is an internally generated one, you will only record the legal and registration costs of that asset. Let us talk about the amortization of the patent. If you will extend or if a specific patent will extend the life of an existing patent, then you will use the extended useful life. But if it's not going to extend the life of the existing patent, or if it's only being used to protect the existing patent, then you will use the remaining useful life of the existing patent. Let us talk about the accounting treatment for this software. We have two types of software. We have the purchase software and the internally generated software. For the purchase one, again, just like with other types of asset, you're going to add the purchase price plus the directly attributable cost. But for the internally generated software, the development cost should be capitalized if it's after you have observed the technological feasibility. When we say that the software is technically feasible, then there should be an existing detailed program design and there should be a working model. Let's say that the software is an integral part of a tangible asset, then the software and the tangible asset will be recorded under PAS 16 or the accounting standard for property, plant, and equipment. But if a specific software can be licensed out or can be rented out to another party, then that's the only time that you will record under PAS 38 or IAS 38. Organizational costs are startup costs such as incorporation costs. Let's say the cost that you have incurred when you are processing or when you are applying for your certificate of incorporation, for your bylaws, etc. Then your pre-operating and pre-opening costs. All of those are organizational costs. As a general rule, all organizational costs will be an outright expense. But there are scenarios wherein you will not recognize it as an outright expense. First, if the organizational cost is to be considered as part of transaction costs for issuing equity instrument or debt instrument. The transaction cost for the equity instrument should be deducted from the share premium. But if the transaction cost is from the issuing of debt securities, then you will deduct the transaction cost from the carrying amount of the financial liability. Then the second possible scenario is that the organizational cost is to be treated as a direct cost. If it's directly related to the acquisition of the asset, if it's directly related to the exploration of mineral resources, then it should be capitalized. Let us talk about the accounting treatment for the lump sum price of intangible assets. First is that you're going to use the relative fair market values. Then the second one is you're going to amortize an intangible asset based on its respective useful life. Meaning to say, for every types of asset, there will be a respective useful life or there will be a respective manner of how you will going to amortize them. For example, we have here the allocated cost of 5 million pesos, but the fair market value of different intangible assets are presented. Then you're going to use the fair market value to generate a fraction. Then you're going to multiply that fraction to the allocated cost. Just like with this example. To give you the relevant formula, that is the total cost of the intangible asset, that is the total capitalized cost under the accounting standards, then you will going to divide it or you're going to spread it out using the useful life or the legal life. Here are the summaries of the legal life. For the patents, it is the useful life or 20 years, whichever is shorter. For the copyright, again, that is the life of the creator plus 50 years or the useful life, whichever is shorter. For the franchise, it can have a finite useful life or indefinite useful life. For the software, for the brands, customers list, websites, you will going to amortize it over its useful life. That's the end of the lecture recording for the intangible assets. Thank you all for watching.